This 4-square-foot garden feeds a family. The Amish potato method nobody talks about. Have you ever stood in the middle of your garden, looking at a long row of plants you spent weeks tending, and quietly asked yourself a question that most gardeners never say out loud? Why am I using so much space to grow so little food? I remember the exact moment that question hit me. It was late summer, the kind of afternoon when the sun sits low and warm over the garden beds, and I was digging up my potatoes the same way I had done for years. 30 feet of carefully tended soil stretched across the yard. I had planted them in neat rows in early spring, dug trenches exactly the way every gardening book said to, dropped in the seed potatoes, covered them, and spent the entire season coming back again and again to hill the soil around the stems. It was work I had learned to accept as part of gardening. Dig, hill, water, wait, repeat. And when harvest day finally came, I stood there with a fork in the soil, pulling up plant after plant, expecting the kind of abundance every gardener hopes for after months of care. But what came out of the ground was fine. Not terrible, just fine. A few potatoes here, a few there, maybe a pound or two per plant if the season had been kind. When I finished digging the entire row, the harvest filled a few buckets. Looking at them sitting there in the dirt, I realized something that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I had dedicated nearly a quarter of my garden to potatoes, and the result simply didn't match the space or effort. At the time, I thought that was just the reality of growing potatoes. That's how everyone did it. That's what the books showed. That's what generations of gardeners had done before me. So I kept repeating the same method year after year, never questioning it too deeply. Until one day, during a visit to a small rural community in Ohio, something completely unexpected caught my eye. It wasn't in a large farm field. It wasn't part of some complicated agricultural system. It was sitting quietly beside a weathered wooden barn in Amish country, almost like an afterthought. At first, I barely noticed it. It looked like nothing more than a simple cylinder made from wire fencing, about 2 feet across, maybe 3 feet tall. Nothing impressive. No fancy irrigation lines, no raised beds, no elaborate structure. Just a modest wire tower filled with straw and soil. But what happened next is the moment I still think about whenever someone tells me they need a huge garden to grow real food. The farmer walked over to the tower on harvest day, reached down and clipped the wire ties holding it together. The cylinder slowly unwrapped and opened outward. And then something incredible happened. Potatoes began appearing everywhere. Not just at the bottom like I expected, but at every level inside the column. They spilled out of the straw and compost in layers, tumbling down onto the ground like someone had tipped over a basket of food. There were potatoes near the top, potatoes in the middle, potatoes near the base, dozens of them, maybe more than I could count in that moment. All from a structure that occupied less space than a small patio table. I remember standing there watching, almost confused at first, because my brain was still stuck in the idea that potatoes belonged in long garden rows. Yet here was this tiny tower producing more food than the entire 30-foot bed I had just harvested back home. That was the moment something shifted in my thinking. It wasn't a new seed variety. It wasn't expensive fertilizer. It wasn't some secret agricultural technology. It was something much simpler, and in some ways much more powerful. I realized the real problem had never been my soil. It wasn't my climate. It wasn't even the size of my garden. The problem was that I didn't truly understand how the potato plant actually works. And once you see that difference, once you understand the biology behind how potatoes grow, you start to realize that many of the traditional methods we follow in gardening are not necessarily the most productive ones. In fact, sometimes the biggest limitation in our gardens isn't the land we have. It's the assumptions we carry about how plants are supposed to grow. That small Amish potato tower wasn't just a clever trick for saving space. It was a completely different way of thinking about food production, a way of working with the plant instead of simply repeating the methods we've always been told to use. And once I understood what was really happening inside that simple structure, I realized something that every gardener, homesteader, and backyard grower should hear at least once. Sometimes the difference between an average harvest and an extraordinary one isn't more land. It's a better understanding of the plant itself. The more I thought about that moment beside the barn, the more one question kept circling in my mind. What exactly was happening inside that tower that wasn't happening in my garden rows? Because at first glance, nothing about it seemed revolutionary. It wasn't a new machine. It wasn't some engineered container. And it certainly wasn't the result of modern agricultural technology. It was simply a different way of working with the plant. And when you slow down long enough to understand how a potato actually grows, the entire system suddenly makes sense in a way that most gardening advice never explains. Potatoes don't just produce randomly underground the way many people imagine. They grow from specialized underground stems called stolons, which extend outward from the main plant stem beneath the soil. At the end of those stolons, the plant begins forming tubers, the potatoes we eventually harvest. But here's the critical detail that most gardeners are never taught. Stolons only form on the portion of the plant stem that is buried under soil or organic material. They don't form on the exposed stem above ground, and they don't form directly from the roots themselves. That means the productive area of the plant is determined by how much of its stem is buried throughout the growing season. Once you realize this, the limitations of the traditional row method become obvious. In a typical garden row, potatoes are planted a few inches deep in a trench. When the plants grow 6 or 8 inches tall, gardeners hill soil around the base of the plant. Sometimes this is done a second time later in the season. But even with those efforts, only a small portion of the plant stem ends up buried. Maybe a few extra inches. Maybe a little more if the gardener is diligent. The rest of the plant grows upward into the air where it can no longer produce new stolons. In other words, most of the plant's potential production space is never used. The tower system flips that entire idea on its head. Instead of allowing the plant to grow upward into empty air, the tower allows the gardener to continuously bury new sections of the stem as the plant grows taller. Each time the plant gains several inches of height, more compost, soil, or straw is gently added around the stem, covering part of the plant while leaving the top leaves exposed to sunlight. That buried section of stem then becomes a new zone where stolons can form. More stolons mean more places for potatoes to develop. And when this process repeats several times throughout the season, the plant effectively creates multiple layers of production stacked vertically inside the tower. What looks like a simple column of soil from the outside is actually a series of underground growth zones working simultaneously. The base layer forms potatoes first, then the middle layers begin producing, and eventually the upper layers contribute their own harvest. It's almost like turning a single plant into a multi-story food factory operating within a very small footprint. What impressed me most when I first understood this concept was how logical it was. The Amish farmers didn't invent a new kind of potato, and they didn't rely on complicated equipment. They simply paid attention to how the plant behaves in nature and designed a growing system that amplifies that behavior instead of restricting it. That kind of observation is something traditional farming communities have practiced for generations. Rather than forcing plants into rigid systems, they adapt their methods to match the biology of the crop. Modern gardening advice sometimes overlooks that principle because many techniques are passed down without explaining the science behind them. But once you see the biology clearly, you begin to realize that the tower method isn't a gardening trick at all. It's simply allowing the potato plant to do what it naturally wants to do, produce tubers along buried stems, while giving it far more vertical space to do so. And when that happens inside a structure only a few feet wide, the results can feel almost unbelievable compared to what most gardeners expect from a traditional potato patch. Once you begin to understand this idea of buried stems and vertical production, another realization follows almost immediately, and it's one that many gardeners overlook the first time they try growing potatoes in towers. The structure itself is only part of the system. The plant variety you choose plays an equally important role, sometimes even more important than the tower design. This is where a lot of people unknowingly sabotage their results. They build the tower perfectly, follow every step carefully, and then wonder why the harvest doesn't look dramatically different from what they used to dig from the ground. The reason often comes down to the genetics of the potato variety they planted. Not all potatoes behave the same way underground. Some varieties are what gardeners refer to as determinate potatoes. These plants tend to produce most of their tubers in a single layer near the base of the plant. Once those potatoes begin forming, the plant shifts its energy toward enlarging them rather than creating new stolons higher along the stem. Even if you continue adding soil and burying more of the plant, these varieties rarely respond by forming additional layers of potatoes. They simply continue growing foliage above ground, while the underground production stays concentrated near the bottom. Varieties like Yukon Gold or Red Norland are popular examples of this type. They are reliable, productive, and widely available, which is why many gardeners naturally choose them when planting a tower for the first time. But when used in a vertical system, they often behave almost exactly the same as they would in a traditional garden row. The tower becomes little more than a container rather than a true production multiplier. Other potato varieties behave very differently. These are known as indeterminate potatoes. Instead of limiting tuber formation to a single zone near the base, they continue producing stolons along the buried stem as the plant grows taller. Each time a new section of stem is covered with soil or compost, the plant treats that buried portion as fresh territory for tuber production. New stolons form, and eventually new potatoes begin developing along those underground stems. Over time, this creates multiple vertical layers of growth within the tower, which is exactly what makes the system so productive in such a small footprint. Varieties commonly associated with this growth habit include Russet Burbank, German Butterball, Elba, and several other long-season potatoes that naturally respond well to repeated hilling. These plants tend to grow taller and remain active longer in the season, which gives the gardener more opportunities to add layers and extend the productive stem length. When those conditions align with good sunlight, healthy soil, and steady moisture, the difference in yield can be remarkable. Another detail that often gets overlooked is the quality of the seed potatoes themselves. Many beginners assume they can simply plant potatoes from the grocery store, but commercial potatoes are frequently treated with sprout inhibitors designed to prevent them from growing during storage. Even if they eventually sprout, those treatments can weaken the plant's early development and reduce overall vigor. Seed potatoes purchased from reputable growers are specifically selected and stored to maintain strong germination and healthy growth. They may look like ordinary potatoes, but they carry the vitality needed to support a full season of production. In a vertical system where multiple layers depend on steady growth, that early vigor matters more than many gardeners realize. Choosing the right variety and healthy seed potatoes sets the stage for everything that follows. Without those two foundations, even the best designed tower cannot fully unlock the production potential hidden within the potato plant. Once the right variety has been chosen and healthy seed potatoes are ready, the next step in the process may seem small, but it quietly determines how strong the plants will be during the first weeks of growth. Many gardeners are eager to plant immediately, especially after cutting their seed potatoes into pieces. But taking a little time before planting can make a noticeable difference in the success of the entire tower. Each seed potato is typically cut into chunks about the size of a large egg, making sure that every piece contains at least 1 or 2 healthy eyes. Those small eyes are the future shoots that will grow upward and eventually become the leafy plant above the soil. Inside each piece of potato is stored energy that fuels the early stages of growth, allowing the plant to push through the soil before its leaves begin producing energy from sunlight. But when a potato is freshly cut, the exposed surface is vulnerable. If it is placed immediately into moist compost or soil, that cut surface can absorb too much moisture and begin to rot before the plant ever gets the chance to sprout. Instead, experienced growers allow the cut pieces to rest in a cool, dry, shaded place for a couple of days. During this short waiting period, something interesting happens. The exposed surface begins to dry slightly and form a thin protective layer. Gardeners often call this process callousing. It acts almost like a natural seal over the wound, reducing the chance of rot or fungal infection once the seed pieces are planted. It's a small step, but it dramatically improves the survival rate of the seed potatoes and helps ensure that each piece produces a strong, healthy plant. With the seed potatoes prepared, attention turns to the tower itself. The beauty of the structure is its simplicity. A section of welded wire fencing is rolled into a cylinder roughly 2 feet in diameter and about 3 feet tall. The ends are secured together with wire ties or simple clips so the tower holds its shape during the growing season. This size turns out to be a practical balance between stability and productivity. A structure much smaller would restrict the plant's root space, while a much taller tower could become unstable once filled with moist compost and straw. The base of the tower is usually lined with a thick layer of loose straw placed along the inside edges. This straw serves 2 important purposes. First, it prevents the growing mix from spilling out through the openings in the wire fencing. Second, it creates a breathable base that improves air circulation and helps excess moisture drain away from the bottom of the structure. Potatoes thrive in soil that remains evenly moist, but they struggle in conditions where water collects and lingers around the roots. That bottom layer of straw acts like a natural buffer, keeping the base of the tower from becoming waterlogged. Once the base is prepared, the first layer of growing mix is added. This mixture often contains compost blended with loose soil or additional straw to create a texture that is light and airy rather than dense and compact. The goal is a growing medium that holds moisture while still allowing oxygen to move freely through the soil. Roots need both water and air to thrive, and a fluffy organic mix provides that balance. After several inches of this mixture are placed inside the tower, the prepared seed potato pieces are spaced evenly across the surface. Each piece is positioned with the eyes facing upward so the new shoots will naturally grow toward the sunlight. They are then gently covered with another layer of the compost mixture, burying them several inches beneath the surface. At this point, the tower may only be partially filled, but the foundation of the entire system has been set. Beneath that quiet layer of soil and straw, the seed potatoes begin their slow transformation into the plants that will eventually fill the tower with stacked layers of food. Once the tower has been planted and the seed potatoes are resting beneath that first layer of compost and straw, the garden enters a quiet phase that can feel deceptively uneventful. For a week or two, nothing visible seems to happen. The surface of the tower looks the same as the day it was planted. But beneath that loose soil, a remarkable transformation is beginning. The seed potato pieces are slowly waking up, drawing on the stored energy inside them to push out the first shoots. Tiny roots begin spreading into the surrounding compost, anchoring the young plant and searching for moisture and nutrients. Eventually, small green tips break through the surface and begin reaching toward the sunlight. For many gardeners, this moment is the true beginning of the tower's vertical system. Those first shoots signal that the plant is strong enough to start the process that makes this method so productive. As the stems grow taller and reach roughly 8 to 10 inches above the surface, it becomes time for the first major step in the vertical growing cycle. Instead of leaving the plant fully exposed, another layer of compost and straw is gently added around the stem. Most of the plant is buried again, but the top few inches of leaves are left uncovered so the plant can continue capturing sunlight. That balance is important. The leaves above the soil provide the energy that powers everything happening below, while the buried portion of the stem becomes the place where new stolons can form. From the outside, it may look as though the plant is being buried repeatedly, but in reality, the gardener is creating new underground territory for the plant to use. Over the next couple of weeks, the process repeats itself. The plant continues growing upward, sending fresh leaves into the sunlight. Once it reaches another 8 to 10 inches of height, another layer of compost is added around the stem. Again, the lower portion of the plant becomes buried while the top remains exposed. Each cycle extends the length of buried stem and creates another potential zone for tuber production. Inside the tower, these buried sections slowly begin forming stolons that stretch outward through the loose organic mix. At the tips of those stolons, small potatoes begin forming in places where nothing existed only weeks before. By the middle of the growing season, the tower begins to resemble a simple column of soil from the outside, but inside it is quietly transforming into a stacked system of production. Several layers of potatoes are forming at different stages of development, each one occupying the space created by the gardener's careful layering process. Most towers complete 3 or 4 of these cycles before reaching their full height, which is usually around 3 feet tall. That height turns out to be a practical limit for stability as well as plant health. Any taller, and the structure could become top-heavy once filled with moist compost, while the plant itself may struggle to push enough foliage above the surface to continue photosynthesis effectively. The timing of these layers depends somewhat on climate and growing conditions. In cooler regions where the season is shorter, the plant may only complete a few cycles before shifting its energy toward tuber development. In warmer regions with longer growing seasons, an additional layer may be possible. Either way, the goal remains the same: extend the buried stem gradually while maintaining healthy foliage above the tower. Throughout this process, the gardener begins to see the deeper logic behind the system. Each new layer represents another opportunity for the plant to produce food. Instead of relying on a single underground zone like traditional rows, the tower builds multiple production levels within the same small footprint, quietly multiplying the potential harvest as the season unfolds. As the tower continues filling with layers and the plant grows steadily toward its full height, another part of the system begins demanding careful attention: moisture and nutrition. At first glance, a potato tower may look like nothing more than a vertical garden bed, but the way water moves through it is very different from a traditional row planted directly in the ground. In a normal garden bed, the surrounding soil acts like a reservoir. It holds moisture, buffers temperature changes, and releases water slowly to the roots over time. A tower, however, is exposed on all sides. Air moves through the wire walls, sunlight warms the surface more quickly, and moisture can evaporate faster than many gardeners expect. Because of this, watering becomes one of the most important habits to develop when growing potatoes vertically. Instead of watering heavily once in a while, the goal is consistent moisture throughout the entire column of soil. One simple method many experienced gardeners use is the 3-inch rule. By pushing a finger or small stick about 3 inches into the growing mix, it becomes easy to check whether the tower is drying out. If the soil feels dry at that depth, it's time to water deeply enough that moisture reaches the lower layers of the tower. In cooler weather, this may only need to happen once or twice a week, but during hot summer days, the tower can lose moisture quickly, sometimes requiring watering every other day. The key is avoiding extremes. Long dry periods followed by sudden heavy watering can cause potatoes to crack or grow unevenly, while overly saturated soil can lead to rot around the roots. A steady rhythm of watering allows the plant to grow smoothly and directs its energy toward building healthy tubers underground. Nutrition also plays an important role, though potatoes are surprisingly forgiving when grown in rich organic material. A tower filled with high-quality compost already contains many of the nutrients the plant needs throughout the season. Compost releases nutrients slowly, supporting both foliage growth above the soil and tuber development below. Some gardeners choose to boost this process occasionally with compost tea or a balanced organic fertilizer applied every few weeks. But moderation matters here as well. Too much nitrogen, which is often the dominant nutrient in many fertilizers, can push the plant to produce lush, vigorous leaves while limiting the size and number of potatoes forming underground. When that happens, the tower may look impressive above the surface, but deliver disappointing results at harvest. Balanced nutrition allows the plant to maintain healthy foliage while gradually directing more of its energy into tuber formation as the season progresses. Sunlight, though often overlooked in discussions about towers, is another essential part of the system. Potatoes thrive in full sun and perform best when they receive at least 6 to 8 hours of direct light each day. The leaves exposed at the top of the tower act like solar panels, converting sunlight into the energy the plant sends downward to fuel potato formation. When the tower is placed in a shaded location, the plant may still grow, but the reduced photosynthesis limits how much energy can be directed into tuber production. Over time, this usually results in smaller harvests, even if every other step of the process has been done correctly. When the tower receives steady sunlight, consistent watering, and balanced nutrients, the plant enters the most productive stage of its life cycle. Deep inside the column of soil and straw, the stolons continue forming, and the small tubers that began weeks earlier gradually swell into full potatoes. From the outside, nothing dramatic appears to be happening, but beneath the surface, the tower is quietly storing the results of months of patient care, layer by layer, waiting for the moment when the season finally reaches its harvest. As the season moves toward late summer, something subtle begins to change in the potato tower. For weeks, the plant has focused its energy on upward growth, sending new leaves into the sunlight, while the buried stems quietly produced stolons beneath the surface. But eventually, the plant reaches a turning point in its life cycle. One of the first signs of this shift is flowering. Small blossoms may appear near the top of the plant, often white, pale purple, or light pink, depending on the variety. These flowers are not the harvest themselves, but they act as a signal that the plant has entered a new stage. At this point, the potato plant begins directing more of its internal energy toward the tubers growing underground, rather than continuing to extend new stems upward. For the gardener, this moment becomes an important signal as well. It usually means the layering process has reached its end. Adding more compost or straw at this stage no longer benefits the plant, because the main period of stolon formation has already passed. Instead, the focus shifts toward allowing the existing potatoes inside the tower to grow larger and mature fully. During the following weeks, the foliage at the top of the plant may continue looking green and healthy, but gradually subtle changes appear. The vibrant leaves begin losing some of their deep color, and the stems slowly weaken as the plant redirects its remaining energy into the tubers below. This stage requires patience from the gardener. It can be tempting to harvest early, especially when curiosity begins to build about what might be hidden inside the tower. But those final weeks are when the potatoes gain much of their size and develop thicker skins that allow them to store well after harvest. Waiting through this stage ensures that the effort invested throughout the season reaches its full potential. Eventually, the leaves begin turning yellow and then brown as the plant completes its life cycle. This natural dieback is the clearest signal that harvest time has arrived. Unlike traditional potato beds, where digging becomes the hardest part of the process, the tower system turns harvest day into one of the most satisfying moments of the entire gardening season. Instead of pushing a shovel into the soil and searching carefully through the ground, the gardener simply removes the wire ties holding the tower together. As the cylinder opens and the sides fall outward, the entire column of compost and straw loosens and collapses gently onto the ground. Inside that pile, potatoes appear from multiple layers throughout the structure. Some may be near the base, where the first stolons formed early in the season, while others emerge from the middle and upper layers created during later growth cycles. What once looked like a simple tower of soil now reveals the hidden system of stacked production that developed over months of careful layering. The potatoes are usually clean and easy to gather because they grew within loose organic material rather than dense soil. Many can simply be picked up by hand without the risk of cutting them with a shovel. For many gardeners, this moment brings a sense of surprise even after understanding how the system works. Seeing potatoes appear from different levels of the tower creates a visual reminder of the plant's hidden productivity. What began as a few pieces of seed potato months earlier has multiplied into a harvest that fills baskets and containers with food grown from a remarkably small patch of ground. The tower that once stood quietly in the garden now lies open, revealing the result of a season spent working patiently with the natural biology of the plant. When the harvest is finally gathered and the tower has been emptied, most gardeners pause for a moment to take in what just happened. A structure that occupied only a few square feet of space has produced a surprising amount of food, often far more than expected when the season first began. Under normal conditions, a well-managed potato tower can produce somewhere around 40 to 60 pounds of potatoes in a single season. With better soil, consistent watering, and a little experience refining the process, that number can climb even higher. Some gardeners report harvests approaching 80 or even 100 pounds from a single tower when everything aligns perfectly. But even the more modest harvests carry an important lesson. The real power of this method is not just the number of potatoes it produces. It's the efficiency of the space being used. In a traditional garden, producing that amount of food might require a long bed stretching across a large portion of the yard. The tower concentrates that production into a footprint smaller than many patio tables. For gardeners with limited space, that efficiency can completely change how they think about what their garden is capable of producing. A small backyard, a narrow side yard, or even a sunny corner near a fence can suddenly become a meaningful source of food rather than just decorative greenery. And for those who prefer an even simpler approach, the same biological principle can be used without building a tower at all. Some gardeners grow potatoes directly on the ground using thick layers of straw instead of soil. In this method, seed potatoes are placed on the surface of the soil and covered with several inches of loose straw. As the plants grow taller, additional straw is added around the stems in much the same way that compost is layered inside the tower. Over time, the mound grows higher, creating buried sections of stem where stolons can form. By the end of the season, the straw mound may stand 2 feet or more above the ground, and when harvest arrives, the gardener simply pulls the straw apart to reveal the potatoes hidden inside. The result is often surprisingly productive, sometimes yielding 50 pounds or more with very little digging or heavy labor. Whether using a wire tower or a simple straw mound, the deeper lesson remains the same. Potatoes respond powerfully when their natural growth pattern is understood and supported. By gradually burying sections of stem as the plant grows, the gardener multiplies the number of places where tubers can form. It's a method built on observation rather than complexity, and that simplicity is part of what makes it so appealing. In a world where food production often feels distant and industrial, techniques like this remind us that a small piece of land can still produce meaningful harvests when we pay attention to how plants actually grow. The potato tower is more than a clever garden experiment. It's a quiet example of how thoughtful methods can turn even a tiny space into a surprisingly productive source of food. After a season of watching the tower grow, layering soil, adjusting water, and finally gathering the harvest, most gardeners come away with something more valuable than just a basket of potatoes. They walk away with a different way of thinking about food. Because once you see how much production can come from such a small space, it becomes difficult to look at a garden the same way again. Many people assume that producing meaningful amounts of food requires acres of land, complicated systems, or expensive equipment. But the quiet lesson hidden inside the potato tower tells a different story. Sometimes the biggest change in productivity comes from understanding the plant itself. The Amish farmers who popularized this method did not invent a new crop or rely on advanced technology. What they practiced was something far older and simpler: careful observation. For generations, they watched how plants behaved, how stems grew, how roots spread, and how crops responded to soil, sunlight, and moisture. Instead of forcing the plant into a rigid system, they adjusted their growing methods to match the plant's natural tendencies. That philosophy is what makes the potato tower so powerful. It isn't about building a special structure. The wire cylinder and layers of compost are simply tools that help the plant express its full potential. The real secret lies in understanding the biology of the crop and giving it the environment it needs to multiply its production. When gardeners begin applying this mindset to the rest of their garden, something interesting happens. The focus shifts from simply planting crops to designing systems that support them more effectively. Vertical growing, layered soil systems, succession planting, and careful crop selection all begin to make more sense. Each method becomes another way of working with nature instead of constantly struggling against it. Even a small backyard garden can start producing far more food than most people expect. A narrow bed along a fence might hold climbing beans and cucumbers that grow upward instead of outward. A sunny corner could support a few containers of tomatoes or peppers. A patch of soil that once seemed too small for potatoes might suddenly produce dozens of pounds through a simple tower. Slowly, the garden begins transforming from a decorative hobby space into something more meaningful. It becomes a place where food is grown intentionally, where small improvements in understanding lead to larger harvests over time. For many people, that shift in perspective becomes the real reward of the entire experience. The potatoes harvested from the tower will eventually be eaten or stored away for winter meals, but the knowledge gained from the process remains. Each season offers another opportunity to refine the system, improve the soil, experiment with new varieties, and deepen the connection between gardener and plant. And in a world where food systems often feel distant and impersonal, that connection carries a quiet kind of independence. It reminds us that even in a modest backyard, with a few simple materials and a little patience, it is still possible to grow a meaningful portion of our own food. As that realization settles in, the potato tower begins to represent something larger than a single gardening technique. It becomes a small example of what thoughtful, intentional growing can accomplish when space is used wisely. Many modern gardeners start with the assumption that productivity is tied directly to land size. More space must mean more food. Yet methods like this challenge that idea in a quiet but powerful way. When space is limited, creativity becomes just as important as soil. A gardener starts asking new questions. Instead of wondering how to expand the garden outward, the question becomes how to use each square foot more intelligently. What plants grow vertically instead of sprawling across the ground? Which crops produce the most calories in the smallest space? How can sunlight, soil health, and planting patterns be arranged so that every plant contributes as much as possible to the harvest? These questions gradually reshape the entire garden. A small yard begins to look less like a collection of separate plants and more like a living system designed for production. The potato tower often becomes the first step in that transition. Once gardeners see what one vertical structure can do, they begin experimenting with others. Tomatoes climb trellises instead of spreading across beds. Beans grow upward along simple frames. Squash and cucumbers are guided along supports that lift their vines into the air. Even herbs and greens find their place in stacked containers or narrow spaces between larger crops. Little by little, the garden begins to grow in 3 dimensions, rather than just across the surface of the soil. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It grows from observation, patience, and a willingness to learn from each season. Some towers produce more potatoes than expected, while others teach lessons about watering or soil balance. Some varieties thrive, while others reveal which crops are best suited to a particular climate. Each year adds another layer of experience, much like the layers of soil that build the potato tower itself. Over time, the gardener becomes less focused on individual techniques and more focused on the larger philosophy behind them. The goal is no longer simply to plant and harvest, but to design a garden that works naturally with the environment around it. Sunlight, rainfall, soil health, and plant biology all become part of the decision-making process. When those elements begin working together, even a modest backyard can become surprisingly productive. And perhaps the most encouraging part of all is how accessible this approach is. Building a potato tower requires only a few simple materials: a roll of wire fencing, some compost or straw, a handful of seed potatoes, and a patch of sunlight are enough to begin. No expensive equipment is required. No specialized training is necessary. The method relies on observation and patience more than anything else. That simplicity is part of why it has endured for generations among practical growers. It proves that meaningful food production does not always require large farms or complex systems. Sometimes it begins with a single experiment in the garden, a small structure standing quietly in the corner of the yard. And as the season unfolds, that small structure gradually fills with layers of growth, reminding us that even the smallest space can hold the potential for abundance when we learn to grow with the plant rather than simply around it. When I think back to that quiet afternoon beside the barn, the image that stays with me most isn't just the tower itself. It's the moment the wire was opened and the potatoes began appearing from every layer inside, almost like a hidden harvest revealing itself all at once. At the time, it felt surprising, almost unbelievable, but after understanding how the plant works, it begins to feel completely logical. The potato wasn't performing a miracle. It was simply doing what it had always been designed to do, given the right conditions and enough space along its buried stem to produce. That small tower, standing on just a few square feet of soil, became a reminder that sometimes abundance doesn't come from expanding outward, but from thinking more carefully about how we use the space we already have. In many ways, that lesson reaches far beyond potatoes. Every garden holds opportunities like this waiting to be discovered. A narrow strip of sunlight beside a fence, a small patch of soil behind the house, even a corner that once seemed too small to matter can become productive when plants are allowed to grow according to their natural patterns. The Amish farmers who practiced methods like this didn't rely on complicated systems or expensive equipment. They relied on observation, patience, and a deep familiarity with how plants behave when given the chance to thrive. That quiet knowledge is still available to anyone willing to experiment and learn season by season. And perhaps that is the most encouraging part of all. Food independence does not always begin with acres of farmland. Sometimes it begins with a single plant, a small tower of soil and straw, and a gardener who is curious enough to ask whether a tiny piece of ground might be capable of far more than it first appears.